In the parched savanna of Burkina Faso, where the wind carries more dust than hope, something happened that the world had never seen before. Helicopters roared low across rebel-held territory, but instead of unleashing rockets, they opened their bellies to release 10,000 bags of grain beans, powdered milk, and medicine. For a people who had gone to bed hungry for months, it was as if the sky itself had decided to feed them. Children ran barefoot into the fields, mothers lifted their hands to heaven, and fathers wept as burlap sacks fell like manna from above. This was no accident. It was the decision of a young soldier-turned-leader, Captain Ibrahim Traore. In a land where rebels used hunger as their deadliest weapon, he dared to fight back with compassion. It was a gamble, costly, dangerous, and condemned by many. But Traore believed that the price of doing nothing was far greater. And so, the question echoes far beyond Burkina Faso. Can food be stronger than bullets? Can kindness dismantle fear? Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and stand with us for an Africa that will never bow again. In the dusty heart of West Africa lies Burkina Faso, a nation that many outside its borders rarely mention. And when they do, it is often in the language of crisis. Landlocked, scarred by decades of poverty and trapped in the unforgiving Sahel, Burkina Faso has become a battlefield not just of weapons, but of survival itself. For years, insurgents spread across the countryside, carving out zones of control, terrorizing villages, and enforcing their will with the sharpest of blades' hunger. Roads were cut off, markets were shut down. In towns like Djibo, once vibrant centers of trade, entire populations found themselves besieged. Over 60% of the national territory slipped from the government's control, leaving millions stranded in hostile terrain. It was not only bullets that broke families. It was empty stomachs. Mothers boiled leaves in dirty water. Fathers wandered for days in search of a handful of millet, and children slept with hunger gnawing at their ribs. Starvation became the insurgents' most effective weapon for when a family must choose between a rebel's handful of grain or the agony of famine. Obedience too often follows. The capital, Ouagadougou, seemed a world away. Foreign journalists called it a state on the brink, a failed experiment of democracy and aid. Western analysts offered the same prescriptions: send in more soldiers, borrow more money, wait for food convoys guarded by foreign troops. But for the people of Burkina Faso, waiting meant dying. It was in this crucible of suffering that a young soldier stepped forward. Captain Ibrahim Traore, born in 1988, had risen unexpectedly to power, the youngest leader in the world. For some, he was too inexperienced to gamble in human form. For others, he was the embodiment of a long-forgotten dream that Africa might finally produce leaders who served their people first. Traore knew his country faced more than just armed men. It faced despair itself. He looked at the numbers: 2.7 million Burkinabe in crisis-level hunger, tens of thousands of children malnourished, whole villages forgotten by a state too poor and too fractured to reach them. And he made a calculation that few dared to imagine: the most dangerous weapon in the rebels' hands was not the gun, but the grain sack. If he could break their hold on food, he could break their hold on the people. The question was how. Convoys were too slow and too vulnerable. Aid agencies were hamstrung by rules and foreign donors. Traditional armies only deepened fear. Traore needed something radical, something audacious, something that would rewrite the script of war itself. And so, as whispers spread through dusty courtyards and candlelit mosques, the people of Burkina Faso waited. They prayed not for another soldier, not for another speech, but for a sign that someone still remembered them. They did not yet know that their answer would come not from the ground, but from the sky. It began with the thunder of helicopter blades slicing through the evening sky. In rebel-held villages, families rushed into their huts, expecting bombs, fire, and death. For years, those machines of war had been symbols of destruction. But this time, something different happened. The cargo bays opened, and instead of rockets came burlap sacks tumbling into the air. Parachutes bloomed like white flowers across the savannah, drifting gently downward. When the first bag burst open, spilling rice and beans into the dust, silence gave way to cries of disbelief. Mothers clutched their children and wept. Fathers dropped to their knees in gratitude. Children, once terrified of helicopters, chased the falling parachutes as though they were kites carrying hope. 10,000 bags of food and medicine fell that day. Maize, powdered milk, beans, oil, and essential drugs. Commodities that had become rarer than gold. In some villages, people fought back tears as they filled bowls with rice for the first time in months. Others held up the sacks to show the government seal stamped on the side proof that these gifts were not from the rebels, but from Ouagadougou itself. It was not just generosity, it was precision. Captain Traore ordered his pilots to scatter drops unpredictably across a wide swath of land, denying rebels the chance to hoard supplies. Local radio stations broadcast the same message on repeat. These are gifts from your government. This is your nation reaching you. Even if rebels snatched some of the bags, the people knew who had sent them. The operation was staggering in cost. Economists later calculated that over $20 million had been spent procuring packaging and delivering the supplies, a fortune for one of the poorest nations on earth. Advisors warned against it. Parliamentarians whispered about drained reserves. Western observers mocked it as reckless extravagance. But Traore's logic was sharp. The cost of doing nothing was far greater. A starving population would feed the insurgency far faster than bullets. And so, for one astonishing evening, the dusty skies of Burkina Faso were transformed. Instead of smoke, parachutes drifted. Instead of blood, there was bread. For people long forgotten, it was not only nourishment for the body, it was nourishment for dignity. The images spread like wildfire. Photographs of villagers catching food in trembling hands raced across Africa's social media. In Ghana, young men captioned them, "This is leadership." In Mali, elders whispered that Burkina Faso had found a captain who understood both hunger of the body and hunger of the soul. But behind the spectacle lay something deeper. Traore knew this was not merely aid. It was a strategic counterattack. By feeding the people under rebel control, he was severing the roots of the insurgents' power. Each sack of food was not just calories, it was propaganda proof that the government could reach even the unreachable. It turned despair into defiance, fear into faith. What the world witnessed was more than a food drop. It was a redefinition of war itself. Helicopters, once engines of terror, had become flying lifelines. And in that transformation, Ibrahim Traore revealed himself not only as a soldier, but as something rarer, a strategist of compassion. For centuries, wars in Africa had been defined by guns, gold, and foreign aid. But with one daring act, Captain Ibrahim Traore introduced a weapon that confounded his enemy's food. He understood something that foreign generals and think tanks often ignored, that hunger itself was the battlefield. Rebels thrived not because they outgunned the state, but because they outfed it. In villages cut off from trade, insurgents handed out handfuls of millet in exchange for loyalty. A bag of flour became worth more than a speech. A single goat could secure obedience better than a dozen threats. By controlling scarcity, the rebels controlled the people. Traore turned that logic upside down. By dropping 10,000 bags of food, he stripped the rebels of their strongest leverage. For every family that ate from a government sack instead of a rebel handout, the insurgents lost authority. For every child who went to bed with a full stomach, the rebels' story that the state had abandoned them collapsed. It was not mere charity. It was psychological warfare disguised as mercy. Each parachute carried not just grain, but a message. You are not forgotten. Your government still reaches you. In a struggle where legitimacy was worth more than territory, Traore's gamble was brilliant. Critics called it reckless. Economists in Ouagadougou warned that $20 million spent on rice could bankrupt the treasury. Western diplomats muttered that bread cannot replace bullets. But the captain countered with brutal clarity: a starving nation cannot be governed. Hunger is the enemy's sharpest weapon. Feeding our people is not charity, it is security. Indeed, the move was financed not by loans, but by a new doctrine of sovereignty. Traore had already begun reclaiming gold mines from French corporations and taxing foreign telecom giants more aggressively. He funneled this revenue not into foreign banks, but directly into the bellies of his citizens. In doing so, he challenged a decades-old model of dependency where African nations waited for the IMF or World Bank to deliver aid tied to crushing conditions. The symbolism resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. In Mali, elders whispered that perhaps the young captain had stumbled upon a new doctrine of African power. In Niger, where villages faced the same hunger, young men asked why their helicopters carried soldiers but never food. Across the Sahel, people began to see Traore not just as a soldier president, but as a visionary rewriting the playbook of governance. And perhaps most importantly, the operation rekindled something that decades of colonial exploitation, corrupt regimes, and foreign debt had stolen: dignity. To be fed not by outsiders, not by rebels, but by one's own government that was a revolution in itself. For Traore, the drops were not the end, but the beginning. He told his advisors in private, "This is more than rice. This is the foundation of loyalty." By feeding his people, he bought something priceless: trust. Trust that could not be measured in GDP or debt repayments, but in songs sung by children and names painted on mud walls. And so what the world first mocked as extravagance began to look like strategy. A new kind of warfare was unfolding in Burkina Faso, one where kindness was weaponized, and where the most shocking act of leadership was not a military offensive, but a gamble on compassion. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. The aftermath of the food drops was felt first not in battlefields, but in kitchens and marketplaces. In villages once ruled by fear, women lit fires to cook rice from the parachuted sacks. For the first time in months, children ate until their bellies were full. Fathers, instead of surrendering labor to rebels in exchange for food, brought surplus to local markets. Within weeks, these microeconomies stirred back to life. Intelligence reports captured the change. Rebel commanders complained that villagers were refusing to pay taxes in grain or labor. Farmers, emboldened by the food drops, returned to their fields instead of abandoning them. Recruitment slowed. In some villages, elders sent envoys to government camps offering amnesty deals, declaring, "We have seen who feeds us, and it is not the rebels." The social effect rippled outward. Children who once hid at the sound of helicopters now chased them with joy. Mothers prayed openly for the safety of pilots. Songs of gratitude echoed across the savannah, carried by drums and voices that had been silenced for too long. On the mud walls of homes in rebel zones, the word Traore appeared painted by villagers themselves, a silent but unmistakable declaration of allegiance. And beyond Burkina Faso, the world watched. Images of parachutes drifting across the sky went viral across Africa. In Ghana, hashtags read, "This is leadership." In Mali, griots wove the story into their songs. In Nigeria, students debated whether this food from the sky could be the dawn of a new African doctrine. At the African Union, the operation became a case study. Leaders who had long depended on convoys guarded by foreign soldiers now asked themselves, what if feeding civilians could defeat rebels faster than bullets? For a continent accustomed to IMF conditions and World Bank lectures, Traore's gamble was an audacious reminder that sovereignty meant using a nation's wealth for its own people first. Yet the international reaction was not all praise. In Paris, commentators derided the move as populist theater. In Washington, officials feared the precedent it might set that African leaders could defy aid dependency and still gain legitimacy. Reports surfaced that Western diplomats quietly pressured neighboring states to distance themselves from Traore. But among ordinary Africans, the message was clear. Here was a leader who had chosen compassion over convention, sovereignty over subservience. And that struck a chord deeper than any speech. Economists back in Ouagadougou debated the costs. The food drops had drained reserves. Some warned of inflation. But Traore reframed the argument. Weapons cost billions and buy us nothing but graves. This food cost millions and bought us loyalty. For him, loyalty was not an abstract ideal. It was security. It was stability. And in the long run, it was the foundation upon which factories, schools, and farms could rise. Perhaps most surprisingly, the operation did not weaken Burkina Faso's standing, it elevated it. Across the Sahel, whispers spread. If one of Africa's poorest nations could reclaim its gold mines, tax its corporations, and fund its own relief without bowing to Paris or Washington, then why not Mali? Why not Niger? Why not Chad? The spectacle of raining food became more than an act of mercy. It became a symbol of defiance against insurgents, against hunger, and against the structures of dependency that had shackled Africa for generations. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a fragile state, was suddenly at the center of a continental conversation. And Captain Ibrahim Traore, once dismissed as an inexperienced soldier, had become the face of a new possibility that in the 21st century, leadership could be measured not by tanks or treaties, but by the courage to feed one's own people when no one else dared. In the months that followed, the echoes of the food drops grew louder than the sound of helicopters. What began as a desperate gamble to save starving villages evolved into something far greater, a blueprint for a new kind of African leadership. The short-term victories were undeniable. Recruitment into rebel ranks plummeted. Intelligence officers reported that entire villages once loyal to insurgents had begun resisting their demands, hiding food, and even handing over rebel collaborators in exchange for amnesty. For the first time in years, the rebels found themselves losing not just territory, but the hearts and stomachs of the people. But Ibrahim Traore was never content with survival alone. He saw in those 10,000 bags of food a symbol, a stepping stone toward a continental awakening. If hunger had been the weapon that weakened Africa, then feeding people with African resources could be the shield that restored its strength. To sustain his vision, Traore moved quickly. He redirected revenues reclaimed from foreign-controlled gold mines into national grain reserves. He pressed multinational telecoms to pay higher taxes, channeling the funds into irrigation mechanized farming and community grain banks. Behind closed doors, he pushed for a regional food security pact, urging Mali, Niger, and Chad to build collective grain reserves and shared irrigation projects. Famine is a weapon no army can defeat, he argued. But together we can starve hunger itself. It was a doctrine that shook old paradigms. For decades, African states had relied on Western aid shipments that arrived too late, too little, and often bound by debt. But here was Burkina Faso, one of the poorest nations on earth, showing that sovereignty meant using one's own wealth, not waiting for permission, to save one's people. International observers, who first dismissed the food drops as unsustainable theatrics, began to admit grudging respect. Satellite images showed farmers returning to their fields markets, reviving schools reopening. The initial cost of $20 million looked small compared to the billions usually lost to instability, refugees, and endless war. And then came the cultural wave. Across Burkina Faso, murals of helicopters dropping food appeared on school walls and market stalls. Songs were composed celebrating the flying baskets of hope. Children no longer spoke of the government as distant or corrupt. They spoke of it as a protector. In folk memory, the drops became more than aid. They became proof that leadership could be both strong and compassionate. But the resonance spread beyond borders. In Mali, Niger and Guinea young activists pointed to Traore as proof that African leaders could serve their people without bowing to Paris or Washington. Hashtags across the continent proclaimed Africa can feed itself. Of course, risks remained. The rebels adapted threatening villages that accepted government aid. International lenders whispered about sanctions. Western powers, wary of a domino effect, plotted ways to contain Traore's influence. Yet for every scheme hatched abroad, a stronger truth held at home. The people of Burkina Faso had tasted both food and dignity, and they would not easily return to hunger or silence. Traore's genius lay not just in the operation itself, but in the larger vision it seeded. By turning helicopters into lifelines, he had rehearsed for something greater, the creation of networks that could one day deliver not just rice, but goods trade and prosperity across borders, bypassing blockades and dependence. What had seemed like a reckless gamble was in fact a Trojan horse for sovereignty. Food was the first step. Dignity was the second. And beyond them lay the possibility of an Africa no longer begging, no longer waiting but feeding itself and charting its own future. And so, in the savannah skies of Burkina Faso, a new idea was born that the most powerful weapon of the 21st century might not be drones or tanks, but the courage to feed one's people, and in doing so, to feed a continent's hope. The story of 10,000 bags falling from the sky will be remembered not as a stunt, but as a turning point. In a world where too many leaders measure strength in tanks and treaties, Captain Ibrahim Traore reminded us that true power lies in the courage to feed one's people when no one else dares. For Burkina Faso, the impact was immediate: children with full stomachs, markets alive with trade, and villages once lost to fear now daring to resist. For Africa, the meaning was even greater. It was proof that sovereignty is not a slogan, but a choice to use one's own resources for the survival and dignity of one's people, rather than waiting for handouts wrapped in debt. Yes, the risks were enormous. Yes, the cost was staggering. But history is never written by the timid. It is written by those who gamble everything on faith in their people. And Traore's gamble was not on weapons or foreign powers, but on his citizens, mothers, fathers, children who deserved more than hunger and despair. Across the continent, whispers have turned into conversations, and conversations into demands. Why should helicopters only carry bullets? Why can't they carry bread? Why should Africa always wait for permission to feed itself? Perhaps this is why the images of parachutes over the savannah spread so quickly, not just as news, but as prophecy. They spoke to something buried deep in every African heart. The hunger not only for food, but for dignity, for sovereignty, for a future where Africa rises on its own strength. If this story moves something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. And as we close, remember this: 10,000 bags of food were never just calories. They were a declaration that Burkina Faso will not bow, that Africa can do it, that a new dawn is possible. Captain Ibrahim latest news is not just about politics, it is about hope. And the Burkina Faso latest news is not just about crisis, it is about rebirth. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind that they still don't want you to hear.